Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Bianca Beauchemin, and I'm an executive committee member here at the Harriet Tubman Institute. And welcome to our Tubman Talk. Tubman Talk offers an intellectual space that fosters debate among scholars whose research interest focuses on the history and contemporary experiences of African and people of African descent in Canada and globally. It gives individual researchers as well as research teams a platform for exchange. The Institute is thus an intellectual space that offers an opportunity for individual scholars to critically share their research in the spirit of engaging in intellectual debate. I'm very excited today. We have Dr. Damilola Adebayo, who has his talk, The Necropolitics of Labor Relation in the 20th Century Colonial Africa. Before I begin with the bio of Dr. Adebayo, and of the abstract, I would like to take just a minute to make a land acknowledgement. So I wanted to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is governed by the Dishwit One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. In making this land acknowledgement, I honor and acknowledge the land and its people who have been here for thousands of years. In relation, I would be remiss to not mention the current genocide still happening in Gaza and the catastrophic situations in Sudan, Congo, and Haiti. I think it's important for us to contextualize these repressive colonial and imperial oppressions that undergird the current situation. Influenced by my personal Black feminist politics and by all our scholarships, praxis, movements, I recognize that my political commitment mandate and solidarity are bound up and intertwined with the liberation and self-determination of indigenous people, as well as Palestinian, Sudanese, Congolese, and Haitian people. So today, as I mentioned, we have our talk from Dr. Damilola Adebayo. Dr. Damilola Adebayo is an assistant professor of history here at York University. He is a multi-award winning historian of Anglophone West Africa, and particularly looking at Nigeria. His research and teaching interests are at the intersection of the history of socioeconomic life, including labor, labor unions, and collective bargaining, the history of science and technology, including apprenticeships, as well as vocational and technical education, and the role of international organization in the African past. His prize-winning publications have appeared in outlets including Past and Present and the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. His ongoing book project is tentatively entitled Power in the People, Electricity and Urban Life in 19th and 20th Century Nigeria. Adebayo holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Cambridge Africa Scholar. He obtained his BA in history from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, where he was a Grace Leadership Foundation Scholar, and an MA from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland, as a Hans Wilsdorf Foundation Scholars. Introducing a little bit about the talk today, the necropolitics of labor relation in 20th century colonial Africa. The historiography of labor in colonial Africa has been growing since the 1950s. Scholars have researched recruitment and conscription practices, wages, and other employment conditions, discipline and punishment, productivity, protest, and nationalism. This paper builds on the literature by exploring the afterlife of everyday workers, janitor, messengers, army recruit, etc., of the British administration in colonial Nigeria who died in service. Through an analysis of individual level archival records of compassionate gratuities paid to the families of deceased Nigerian workers, the paper contends that colonial era industrial relation did not end at retirement or death. The paper argues that the politics of compassionate gratuity in colonial Nigeria resembles a kind of necropolitics as coined by Achille Mbembe, in which the state reserves the capacity to quantify and monetize the worth of a deceased African worker. the extent of which the colonial government sometimes went to determine eligibility for and limit of compassion, from extensive police investigation to multiple interviews with family members, denoted this capacity to decide which deceased worker did or did not matter. Colonial workers were not only typically breadwinners of their family, they also serve as an interface between their unself-employment dependent and the government and the government. Therefore, the discretionary resolution of each gratuity case has a tangible impact on the living standard, including food, housing, etc., education of extended family members. Consequently, the analysis of the politics of compassionate gratuity opens another vista to examine the relationship between the government and the wider public, ultimately enriching our knowledge of African labor history. This is an incredible topic. I'm very excited to listen, and I'm sure you are too. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Damilola.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And I guess it's fitting to recognize the Ghanaian independence, which is partly responsible for our late start. So, apart from Ransford that I recognize, I don't know whether there's any other Ghanaian in the room, but I guess you're not Ghanaian, you're Nigerian. So it's fitting to say Happy Independence Day to Ghana, the first African country to attain independence in 1957. And the famous Kwame Nkrumah quote saying that Ghanaian independence is not complete without those of every other African countries. And again, that mindset is also tied to some of the issues that I would be exploring in my paper this afternoon, tangentially tied, not directly, of course. Good afternoon again to everyone in the room and to the people online on Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us today. So the key word in my paper, the key word in the title is necropolitics, as obviously you can tell. And it is composed of two words, necro and politics. So in the basic sense, from the Latin roots, necro basically means the dead or corpse. So basically dead body. And so, in other words, we can explain necropolitics as the politics of dead bodies in this context. So, basically, before going into theoretical excursions and other related matters. So, essentially, my talk this afternoon will explore the responses of the colonial governments in British colonial Africa to family members, dependents of colonial workers, junior colonial workers who died in active service. So they were still employed by the colonial government, and their main characteristics is that they were in junior colonial service ranks that are non-pensionable. So here we're looking at how the colonial government quantified, monetized, determined which colonial worker mattered, even in death. And so it's an examination of everyday African workers, everyday African employees of the British colonial administration from 1900 to 1960. So basically the first half of the 20th century up until the colonial period. And while my theoretical intervention and some of my contributions and insights would span the entire continent, the main area of focus in today's talk, the main case study, is Nigeria, which was also the largest British colony in Africa during the colonial period. So, in a nutshell, just to start to hand before I begin, just in case, so that everyone can easily follow my argument. My paper basically is an exploration of the politics of compassionate gratuities uh, paid to dependents of junior colonial African workers who died in non-pensionable positions. The specific focus is on junior workers, so messengers, shopkeepers, etc., who died in service, and the challenges faced by their dependents when they petitioned the colonial governments for payments of compassionate gratuities. Now, when you talk about compassionate, it basically means it's paid out of compassion, right? So it's not out of law, it's not by law. So it's at the mercy of the government to the dependence of the workers. And so the politics, the narratives around how these payments were made reveals a lot, much more than we've encountered in studies of African labor history, as I would show in this paper. So the central question is, what is the worth of a dead colonial worker? And my argument is that the extent to which the colonial government sometimes went to determine the eligibility for and the limits of compassion signified the capacity of the states to determine which colonia matter or did not matter, even in death. And the contribution that I hope that this research would make to the wider African labor history literature will be to demonstrate that industrial relations in colonial Africa did not end when African employees retired or died. So this is the summary of everything that you're going to hear me say this afternoon. And you're going to hear some of these points repeated in the next 25-ish, or do I have more time? Okay, it's 25 minutes that I have left. So, and I hope that those in the room would pay attention and ask me questions, because some of my insights here are still preliminary, and as I'll show you, the research is still in progress. So I'm looking forward to your questions. This audience is largely familiar with general labor issues in Africa, even if you're not historians, at least from York University activist issues. I mean, York University is an activist campus, right? You're not at York University. Okay, it's fine. I'm just taking for granted that when it comes to labor issues, there are many knowledgeable individuals in the room. But that said, that wouldn't stop me from provide a little bit of summary, because my take is on the entire corpus of African labor history. I wouldn't have the time to go through all the major issues one by one. But it is sufficing, as I mentioned in the abstract, to state that African labor historiography has been growing since the 1950s. In fact, labor history is one of the fastest growing fields of African history. From the 1960s, when African historiography became a nationalist endeavor, labor was also a major theme that historians focused on. So it's impossible for me to focus on to sort of summarize all the major interventions and all the major scholarly works that have been produced in the field. So we have studies of recruitment strategies. I mean, recruitment where people were actually recruited, and conscription where forced labor took place, right? So histories of forced labor abound, histories of recruitment abound. Before the World Wars, when after the 1880s and the 1890s, when colonial governments began to claim spaces in Africa and began to expand their coastal territories into the hinterland by building railways and building infrastructure of extraction. They employed African workers, sometimes forcing them to work at the risk of jail or even death. If you take the Congo, for instance. So we have a lot of studies of that particular practice. We also have studies of wages and other terms of employment. So we have historians who have studied wage labor, the kind of wages, wage in kind, wage in cash, wage as public service, wage as an exchange for punishment, etc., prisoner labor, all sorts across all of Africa, from the Portuguese colonies to the French to the Belgian to the British. I mean, this works abound. And in fact, if we were to look for one it's difficult to single out one major book that has really, really touched on most of these issues. But if we were to, if at the risk of excluding a multitude of other texts, there's this huge book that was published by Frederick Cooper in 1996. I think the labor question, right? Decolonization in Africa, the labor question, which essentially explores the history of colonial labor from its origin all the way to the colonial period. It's over 600 pages long, and it's still good. I mean, there are many other works that have been done since then. Individual case studies across all of Africa. In Nigeria, Lisa Lindsay, based at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, published an exciting work on working with looking at gender aspects of labor relations in the early 2000s. And also, even in 2019, we had an edited volume published by an author whom I actually forgot his name now, but I know that he's based at Humboldt University in Germany, a famous historian of Africa, so I shouldn't forget his name. But again, you can usually use those keywords on both universities to find his name because they are enough, trust me. They're also publishing another major book, major intervention in this field, looking at questions of labor productivity and discipline, punishments, etc., and the post-retirement life of African employees of empire, those who resigned or retired and went into politics, even concerns about reintegration into the economy after for instance, African soldiers in the World War. The point I'm trying to make is, without losing most of my time, there is a lot of ground that's been covered, right? So what my project is doing, and I think it's really simple, and I was really surprised I came across this topic by serendipity. It came to me, literally. I wasn't really looking for it, and you'd understand what I mean in a moment. But what my work is trying to do is to open up a new vista by looking at the afterlife, what I call the afterlife of junior colonial workers who died in service. So I am contending that the history of industrial relations between the colonial government and African workers did not end at retirement or when workers die. And that's what you find in the, conservatively speaking, there may be 100 books on African labor history, and I'm talking about colonial labor. I'm not even talking about pre-colonial, going back to the era of the transatlantic slave trade. But in all of this work, the stories end at retirement or death. And I am saying, actually, there is more to be said. After workers die, I am contending that industrial relations continue. And I'm making this claim because of my systematic analysis of about 600 individual level archival records of compassionate gratuities paid to families of dead Nigerian workers. These files are available at the Ibadan branch of the National Archives of Nigeria. Ibadan was where I also had my undergraduate education. I'm just saying that because of the way you said it initially. Don't mind me. So from a conceptual perspective, I am proposing that the politics of compassionate gratuity in colonial Africa, with a focus on Nigeria here, resembles a kind of necropolitics in which the colonial states reserved the capacity to quantify and monetize the worth of a dead African worker. So the concept of necropolitics was popularized by the Cameroonian historian and philosopher Achille Bembe in an article in 2003, and also in a 2019 book of the same title. So he wrote an initial article on the subject published earlier in 2003 and in 2019. So in the 2019 book, in chapter 3 of the 2019 book, Mbembe argues that the ultimate expression, again, the same thing from page 11 of the 2003 article, the ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity of the state to dictate who is able to live and who must die. To be sovereign is to exert one's control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. So Mbembe derives this extreme definition of sovereignty from his reflection on biopower, another idea that was developed by the French thinker Michel Foucault. Mbembe codifies his expression, his own definition as necropolitics, after its Latin etymology, as I stated earlier, necro, the politics of death. So whilst the expression or practice of necropolitics in the modern states is subject to debate, fewer observers would doubt that European powers exercise control over mortality in Africa from the era of the transatlantic slave trade to the end of the Second World War. So although I'm a historian and I'm not a theorist, my reflection on my compassionate gratuity project reveals that Mbembe's necropolitics could be stretched beyond the ability of the states to determine who lives or dies. So with my narrow focus on Nigeria, I would like to propose that even in death, the colonial administration reserved the capacity to quantify and monetize the work as well. Again, I'm repeating my key point for emphasis because it's really simple. So research by Nigerian historians of labor, particularly Gabriel Olusanya, has established that the British colonial government operated a flexible labor policy in the Nigerian civil service that was interpreted or changed to suit varying circumstances. So similarly, although there were guidelines for the payment of compassionate gratuities in the records, they were not always followed. Important matters, such as the category of staff who were qualified for ex gratia awards, the requirements they must have fulfilled while they were alive, or the value of the payment in relation to their last monthly or annual salaries, or even the value of what was awarded eventually based on their dependents. All of these were assessed on a case-by-case basis. So dependents of the workers were at the mercy of the governor or the administrative delegates. So I would now describe my sources and details, and we'll discuss how compassionate gratuities were earned by drawing on stories from two randomly selected files. So one day I was just at home and I decided, let me just pick two files at random, and they tell interesting stories. And if I were to go through each of these cases, you'd realize that there's even more grounds to cover than I can possibly do within the limited time that I have. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. So there are over 600 individual level files on the payments of compassionate gratuities that I have found so far. In fact, there are over 1,000 according to the catalog, but the ones that I was able to find were about 600 or thereabouts. So although I am mostly interested in the politics of gratuity payments, the files themselves provide a great deal of insight into various aspects of the socioeconomic conditions of junior colonial workers who did not hold pensionable positions. So as a result, the files that I'm working with have the potential to expand our knowledge of Nigerian labor history because the colonial government was the largest and most prestigious employer of labor, as I've argued elsewhere. So each file would have a title like this: Compassionate Gratitude to the Dependents of Deceased African Officials, and then the name. So it's individual. This is Mrs. Ehem. Again, I still can't read his name because I just chose this at random, but this person was a station master within the Nigerian Railway, first class station master. But I chose this just to show the kind of significance. So this is a first class station master, considered to be at the upper echelon of the junior rank. I mean, because this is already, by the standard of the colonial era, this is one of the highest ranks that you can aspire to if you're not a professional as an engineer or any other thing like that. And then you have others who are like messengers, clerks, etc. And I would come to that in the two case studies that I'll present to you. So you'd have this kind of letters. In each letter, you'd find details, important details, two categories of information, right? So the first, we are told the name of the dead worker, their hometown, the dates they were employed and died, where they worked and their roles, their years of service, the last salary earned, the number of queries received or good conduct badges won, whether they served during either of the two world wars, and or whether they were decorated with service medals, the number of wives they have, the children they have, and their direct extended families. So, in other words, beyond what I'm even doing in this research, there is a lot more that can be done. We can almost create more like a social network from all of these narratives to see connections with colonial employees. And that, as I mentioned in the conclusion, further stretches even the contribution of this paper further, but also is asking us to look into the narratives of people, everyday people who are not necessarily working for the colonial government, but they are connected to a single colonial worker, further showing the impact of the colonial government over the colonial economy as a whole. So these were typically men. So the files feature men. Most of them were men, and they were mostly the breadwinners of their family, which is a reality consistent with what Frederick Cooper has already analyzed in his book on colonial labor. So men were typically, this whole idea of the man as the breadwinner, and also because of a lot of internal migration within colonial labor, men were typically favored over women, and women became more or less dependents who were not really able to work as they could do during the pre-colonial period. So the second category of information that you'd find in the file would be the life story of the petitioners. So the wives, the adults, children, or siblings of the dead workers. So because petitions are decided on a case-by-case basis, the dependents often had to appeal to pity. Their letters convey the emotional burden of losing a loved one. They talk about their precarious sources of livelihood and their financial reliance on the deceased worker. And if applicable, they highlight the educational status of younger children. The main petitioners usually had little or no Western education and couldn't write in the English language. So their letters were usually handwritten or typed by professional letter writers or a lawyer if they could afford one. And you would see that even most times signatures are usually through thumbprinting as opposed to actual signatures. So whilst these files are from the office of the Commissioner of the Colonies in Lagos, the individuals involved in the 600 files that I have, so from the dead workers to their family members, reflected Nigeria's ethnic diversity. Lagos was both the economic and political capital of Nigeria during the colonial period and beyond, and continuously attracted migrant workers from every part of Nigeria and indeed all of West Africa. And just to further provide an insight into the sources, last year, when I started taking this project more seriously, so I've had these files for a number of years and I didn't do anything with it. So last year I decided, okay, let me take it more seriously. So I decided to apply for the Dean's Award for Research Excellence, the DARE program. Those you could be familiar with that. And that enabled me to employ Amit, as you can see his name, Amit Shah, an undergraduate student, a really good one, for a period of about 3 or 4 months to work with me on the project initially, to sort of help to create a catalog of the files. And this was his poster presentation when they did the award presentation, sometimes in, I think, October or so, October 2024, thereabout. And so some of the tables you can see and some of the summaries you find here also further reveals more information about the sources that I'm working with. So I want to talk about the structure of the individual files and the adjudication process, so we can actually see the power of the colonial government in practice, determining the value of a dead worker. So each file typically begins with a petition addressed to the commissioner of the colony or the chief secretary of government by dependents of workers who died while in government employment. The adjudication process and decisions vary based on the kinds of investigations conducted, the bureaucratic delays encountered, and for no reason at all. So as a result, the number of pages in each file would range from 5 pages to more than 20 pages, depending on the complexity of the cases, the extent to which the government trusts the petitioner's claim, and the extent of the colonial government's compassion. Sometimes the government takes no action on the initial letter, and the petitioners would have to send a reminder. In some cases, the government, through the accountant general's office, pays the last salary that the workers would have earned the month they died, and nothing further. So in one instance, involving Ajayi Ado. Ajayi Ado died on June 16, 1940. He was a messenger at the Nigerian Secretariat who had served meritoriously for 23 years, winning multiple character badges and long service medals. The payment of his last month's salary was the resolution, despite working for 23 years, despite multiple handwritten and thumb-printed follow-up letters from his two wives. All the colonial government did was just to award the last salary and nothing further. After 23 years of active service, that was it for them. When the government was feeling compassionate, additional steps often included a police investigation to confirm that the petitioners were indeed relatives of the deceased. After the government is satisfied that a claim is genuine, an arbitrary amount, typically multiples of the last salary, is decided and awarded either as a lump sum or in installments to the family. There is no methodology to this process. Sometimes the government took pity on petitions involving minors. The years of service don't count, as the Ajayi example that I mentioned earlier indicates. In fact, in Ajayi's case, the dismissal of the gratuity petition did not take into account that he fought on the side of the British Empire during the First World War and won the 1914-1915 Star and the British War Medal and the Victory Medals. So three medals, three awards. Despite all of that, it doesn't count. In other cases where ex gratia payments were awarded, they came with ridiculous conclusions. So Ajayi's case is one story where despite years of service, you'd find nothing done. There are other cases in between. I have another extreme example that I want to share, but there are other cases in between that we found out while we were working on this. So we often find that when dependents have the financial means or maybe family member influence to employ a lawyer, or in some cases, a letter writer, someone, when letters are properly documented, you often find that the colonial government would respond positively. And then when letters were handwritten, when letters, even with multiple follow-ups, you'd often find that the colonial government would either pay nothing or just pay, if someone dies on June 16, they pay the salary from June 1 to June 16, and that's it. Another situation we find is it doesn't matter whether the breadwinning dead worker, the breadwinner who is now the dead worker, it doesn't matter whether they had 5 wives or 3 or 1. It doesn't matter whether the wives are petty traders or not. It doesn't matter what they do, you'd realize, and they often have a lot of wives. As you can see, I'm not sure whether this pie chart is clear enough as Amit prepared. You'd realize that most of the time they had more wives, that most of them had more than 5 wives. This blue portion, you can discard it because we don't know the information. We don't have that. This tiny portion, rather, you can discard it. Most of them had 1 official wife, 1 legal wife. Customary law, by the way. We don't count whether they were married to, whether they had concubines or they were married to, their marriages have not been the marriage rights have not been completed. Those don't count. But most of them, as you can see here, excluding those who had 1 legal wife, most of them had more than 5 wives. This is for 5 wives. So the biggest chunk, 5 wives. This we don't really know, although it's officially reported as 1 wife, right? And then also in terms of number of children, you'd see that the vast majority had about 7 children, 7 or more children. Each deceased worker had 7 or more children. Obviously, usually not from 1 wife, from multiple wives, right? So all of these go a long way to show the kind of stress the kind of economic stress that the loss of the breadwinner, the kind of toll that it took on the entire family. And yet the government is never moved by any of this. Rather, you'd find that, again, as I mentioned, when a lawyer is involved, the processes are shorter. And in the letter, you'd find something like, oh, we write as a representative of XYZ ABC family. Could you please and then they send it to the accountant general's office and everything is resolved. If I have more time after this talk, I'm willing, if anyone is interested in actually seeing what some of these files look like, I have all the primary documents digitized right here in this room that I can show further. I didn't realize that I was going to be able to even have more time to talk about those files and details that have flooded your screen with more images, but I can share with you during the Q&A. So let me now share. Then there's another example that I want to share. Okay, there's another example that I'd love to share just before I reiterate what I'm the argument and conclude again. So in one example where, yeah, thank you. In one example where an ex gratia payment was made, it came with a ridiculous condition. And that ridiculous condition also showcased the power of the colonial government to mandate internal deportation within the same country. So first, there is this curious case of deportation involving the widow of Jacob Ajimeze, who was a machinist at the Nigerian Railway. So Jacob had served for 12 years before dying unexpectedly in December 1939. The widow, Veronica, was able to employ a lawyer to help pursue the gratuity claim. After police investigations, the government awarded an unstated sum. It wasn't clearly stated in the file, we couldn't tell, but insisted that the widow and her 5-year-old daughter must leave Lagos. So despite having lived in Lagos for 12 years, they were to return to Ibuzo, Veronica's hometown in the Asaba district of southeastern Nigeria. In fact, they were offered free transportation, which is more or less what they offer every deportee, right? And at least 4/5, 80% of the gratuity was retained until confirmation was received from the district officer of Ibuzo that Veronica was back in her hometown. So you'd find in this particular case, Lagos is congested, even though as of 1939, Lagos did not even have up to 500,000 people. But Lagos is congested. You have no business here anymore. Your husband is dead. Go back to your hometown. That's an extreme example, which I just thought would highlight the kind of narratives that we're talking about. Again, another curious thing that you'd find, which I mentioned briefly earlier, is that the years of experience, or basically the duration of service in the colonial government, also reviewed something else about the salary discrepancies in salary. So you'd often find that in official reports, when they show you salary scales, they tell you a carpenter earned X amount, a machinist earned B amount, a shopkeeper earned maybe 5 shillings, something like that. But then, as we all know, even in every organization, but it even became clearer in this research, salary scale and what people actually earned were different. And so you find that people with 23 years of service were significantly underpaid, earning below what was even stated in the salary scale. Sometimes because they received a query as punishment, and then the punishment being transferred to their dependents. So basically, meaning the industrial relation, the labor relation, the personnel management process did not end even after the worker died. You find the punishment being transferred to the dependents, sometimes with no award of gratuity, ridiculous reasons that you would often find, because obviously there aren't usually one reason. One ridiculous reason might be, well, the wife works, you don't need any money. Yeah, literally. But also some other reason would be unstated, but when you read those few pages in between the line, you realize that they're actually transferring the punishment that the worker was serving whilst they were alive to the dependent, continuing to demonstrate the power of the colonial government even after the death of a worker. So the idea that I'm pushing in this paper is really, really simple, as I mentioned earlier, and it's just surprising, and I'm sort of grateful that this idea came to me while I was just looking through these archival sources. And the reason I'm speaking in this gratitude balance is just to say, because it's something, if you're familiar with the historiography of labor, you'd realize that as simple as the narrative that I've presented before you is, to the best of my knowledge, you don't find studies that actually go beyond the demise, the death of a colonial worker. At death, labor relations end. But here, I am proving that the extent to which the colonial government sometimes went to determine the eligibility for compassionate gratuity uh, continue to show how, or continue to demonstrate how the colonial government in British colonial Africa, with reference to Nigeria in this instance, exerted their powers. And also, colonial workers were not only typically the breadwinners of their families often consisted, the direct dependents often consisted of up to as many as 15 minors and adult relatives. So you find that a single colonial worker often served as an interface between their unemployed or self-employed relatives and the government. So what this research also enables me to do is to demonstrate that even though the colonial governments were often the significance and justifications for studying colonial labor and government employment, for instance, in previous publications often include the fact that, well, the colonial government was the largest employer of labor during the colonial period, and that's it. But I'm even saying that there is even a need to further explore the dependent aspect of this narrative, because when you observe that as many as 15 dependents were tied to a junior colonial worker, then it means that if the colonial government employed 5,000 people, multiply that by 15. If you multiply that by 10, that's 50,000. Another 25, so that's 75,000. 75, it means 75,000 more people on average were connected. So in other words, if the colonial government was if the colonial government at every point in time had 5,000 people in their, say for instance, railway department in a particular country, it means they were actually responsible for the livelihood of nearly 80,000 people. And that's another aspect that I think this research is enabling me to think about, is enabling me to think more about as I proceed in the research journey. And then the resolution of each gratuity case, therefore, had a real impact on the standard of living, from feeding, housing to education of family members. And when we study the resolution of each gratuity case, we are actually engaging in a micro study, a micro historical study. We have a micro level opportunity to examine the relationship between the government and the wider public. And ultimately, this would enrich our knowledge of colonial African labor history. Thank you very much.
I'll just Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very original research, and it's really lovely to hear that it was serendipitous in terms of how you came about it. I love that, and I definitely think this is incredibly engaging, and I think there's definitely more to find. You did mention earlier that you're using the conceptual framework of necropolitics, and that you're more of a historian, but using theoretical frameworks is really helping you think through that. And I just wanted to continue on that, because you also use the terminology, the afterlives, sort of the afterlives, and sort of hearkening to Saidiya Hartman's conceptual framework of afterlives of slavery, just the way that it was sort of, but just the way that it was brought up. And that's what it's looked like to me, just in the context that you were bringing it forward, but not necessarily that we have to touch on slavery, but highlighting the afterlife signifies that there's something in the present that like is continuing, sort of a legacy of this. And is there stuff in like the archival research, the initial archival research that you've done, or sort of the links that you've made, that highlight sort of a legacy of these types of frameworks even post-colonial times? Or there may be just some insights or thoughts that you can sort of put together from this preliminary research? Okay.
We are not hearing Damilola.
Thanks, Mohammed. That's it. Although I can't see you, but I know that's you. Anyways, so the question you're asking really is, do we have, what are the legacies of colonial labor policies in the present? And that's not what I'm trying to accomplish in this paper, but it's fairly straightforward to answer that question, although the historian in me is bringing up different exceptions in my mind. I was going to make a simple statement, but then there are multiple nuances that like multiple points to like nuance what I'm about to. But again, the simplistic statement would be to say that colonial institutions persist in Africa in the post-colonial period. Again, now that's a reductive statement. There are like nuances. They are because in the 70s, some countries embarked on nationalization politics, essentially dismantling some institutions of colonialism. But generally speaking, colonial policies and colonial labor policies persist in the post-colonial period. I'll give you one example. When people build houses today in Africa, and I'd speak for Anglophone Africa. I wouldn't want to expand that to the Caribbean, although I won't be surprised if it's also true in the Caribbean setting. But there is the big house and there is the boys' quarters. Is anyone familiar with the idea of the boys' quarters outside of Nigeria? Anyone? Do you have the idea of the boys' quarters? Boys' quarters but every Nigerian in the room understand what boys' quarters mean. Yeah, cool. Because it persists until the very day. But people don't think about the origin of that phrase, boys' quarters. These are residences of grown men with 2 to 3 or more wives and multiple children who were employed as domestic workers, employed by the government, but serving the district officer, serving the senior colonial officers in the main house. So you have the main house, which could be a 4-bedroom bungalow or a duplex or multi-story building, 4 or 5 bedroom, and then you have a 2-bedroom bungalow behind where that person lives. And that institution persists until the present day and is in fact an evidence of wealth, because if you have the big house and then you have a smaller house behind, it means that you're rich enough to have a BQ, a boys' quarters. It's even short from BQ, right? But that's an example of a colonial policy, of a colonial practice that is still pervasive and almost invisible but palpable in the present. Others would include actual politics, actual laws. So for instance, and in this context, again, the nuance, we would have to embark some of the politics, some of the policies that are in place today, even those good politics, came about due to the intervention of the ILO from the 1930s onwards. So for instance, hours of work. How long should someone work? Even in the colonial setting, when colonial governments were reluctant to implement it, they oftentimes do in the 1940s and 50s. So you find that colonial institutions of labor, colonial labor policies, colonial labor laws called ordinances, now acts of parliament, that were introduced during the colonial period continue to persist until the present, if you were to look at afterlife in that context. But then the context in which I am using afterlife is simple. I'm just looking, okay, after this person dies, what next? So that's, I'm just using it in a value-free, not in the Sharia Atman context. I wasn't clear, but I liked saying that, okay, this is value-free. And even though Achille Bembe is as a useful at least theoretician in this context for my work, the idea of necropolitics, even if we don't have Achille Mbembe here, even the etymology itself suits the kind of narratives that I'm trying to promote. So at the end of the day, even though you have complex theoretical engagements with some statements like afterlife, like even fragments of the past, things that historians like to use, and anthropologists and scholars of the humanities and social sciences. Sometimes when you strip them of all these theoretical underpinnings, they're still useful. And that's what I'm trying to do here.
Microphone holder. So I have a question here.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I was very unfamiliar with labor relations in Colombia, so very informative, very new. Something I wanted to ask then is about, you mentioned the effects on the families and that they were very large families that would be impacted by the death of one worker. Um, can you speak to some of maybe the funeral traditions or like the traditions around what to do with that body? I'm sure there's a like a whole thing that you could talk about there, but I'm just curious around what were the costs that associated with that, and then how did that affect the families to have to immediately deal with that without having that compensation?
So that's it. So I don't get things unnecessarily, because of time, so that I can have more questions. That's what I'm trying to say. Funeral traditions vary from ethnic group to ethnic group. It's not something that is determined whether you are a worker in the colonial government. In fact, it's more of a question of class than it is a question of your employer of labor. So if you're rich and if you're from a tradition where you have to kill 10 cows, then you do that. And if you're from, so it doesn't really matter. And at the end of the day, and that leads to another important context that I haven't actually thought about, but again, we just have to take, for instance, the files at their face value, because when you go a little bit further and you start asking questions like, can we even trust that these guys are as poor as they portray themselves to be? Then that would open a different kettle of fish. And since the colonial governments in their investigations, police investigations, did not uncover any scenario where someone was portraying himself to be poorer than they really were, then I'll just keep the answer short to say maybe these people who are poor would have adopted the poor man's way of burying people in their culture. But this is all a guess, essentially. But generally, burial traditions align with ethnic priorities.
And then you can answer them, and then we have one or two questions online. Okay, so I'll go Patrick.
Thank you very much for that brilliant presentation. I have more like one comment, very brief, and also maybe one suggestion or question. So I know I've done a couple of research doing my MA, and one thing I thought I was going to hear from you, perhaps maybe you've not really massaged your sources so much for them to bring those kind of things, but I just want to point it out. I know the colonial government was very emphatic about marriage ordinance, native laws, common laws in terms of marriages. So when you mention some of those dead workers had perhaps more than one wife, two, three, four, five, I was wondering if you've been able to subject your sources so much so that they're able to reveal to you if this issue of more than one wife presenting a petition or a request for compassionate gratuity was able to, create a sort of problem for the colonial government to decide which of the wives. Is it a wife married under the common law, or do we have to take all the wives into consideration when making that compassionate payment? I think that's the question I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. Two questions. The first one, you did mention that you don't want to draw parallels with contemporary issues, but as someone who lived in Nigeria, I don't know if this is history, because we still see issues like gratuity being determined even after the death of some of our parents. Even though you've said you don't want to draw parallels, but the colonial legacies persist, till date. And I don't know what your reaction would be. to that. The second one, you made mention of York University, and also for someone coming from environmental and urban change, if you know what why I'm referring to my faculty. I just want to ask about resistance and agencies. Do you have anything to say about perhaps families of the deceased, putting up like some sort of resistance, trying to negotiate some of these pays, and what have you seen from some of the 600 documents that you've read? Because if it's here in York University, I know there will be so much labor disruption and all that. Yeah, thank you.
And then one more. Oh, two more. Oh,
Right, thank you. Very interesting actually, and I was really intrigued by your aspect of the dead and such like stuff. And of course, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm gonna ask you an anthropological view, but of course, very much speaking to the aspect of what you're doing. And of course, I'm just trying to ask myself, how are you treating this the agency of the dead person here, and then the agency of the document? Because I tend to see a sort of an intersection and overlapping of roles. Okay, so I'm very curious to see, probably just to understand. Of course, I know that might not be very historical, but in the sense that you've decided to dig into the agencies of this document, I think, and especially the point at which you bring in, shifting the blame, okay, of the deceased to the living. So I want to see how those agencies, those three different agencies, in my view, are playing out, and what can they actually teach your historical methodology and theoretical and conceptual, Thank you.
more, and then I'll let it's all you.
It's going to be short, but I'm interested to know if in the case of, I don't know, is this working? Okay. In the case of the hiring the lawyers, who were able to hire them? Do you know those details? Because in the case of if they have so many wives, they came together and they hire one lawyer, and then, I don't know, get the money for everyone. I'm saying, or there were some social differences in between those houses and those families that in some cases they were able to have, they have access or we are able to hire the lawyer. And also the next question will be, what is next? Are you going to be able to do some interviews to get more into these families and their lives, or the afterlives of these people that you are studying? Thank you.
Thank you. I just glad that was a pen to write down.
Okay, hi everyone. Professor, that was a very wonderful presentation and it's quite informative. So, Professor, the two professors that asked questions, or rather the comments they made talking about the post-colonial situation, like you can't really, or rather it's important to think of this gratuity in the recent time, especially because this issue of gratuity still exists even after the colonial stage. So I think that maybe that could be something that could be looked into. And my question to this presentation is, I was just curious about the people that didn't have, or rather, are there records of African workers that weren't given the chance to that didn't receive their gratuity, and then the families involved, did all of them have the platform to make the complaints? Are there like restrictions to people? Are there like selections of to selections to people that should complain. You know, this like the privilege where they're giving to everyone to complain, because I know, or rather I think that people that are victims of this, that would want the deceased family or family member to, that would want to receive the gratuity, like, is there any information about that? I don't know. All right.
Okay, I opened up a can of worms with the afterlives. My apologies.
Thank you. So I'll start with the last question. And thank you, because these are questions that, to be honest, I wasn't actually thinking about before you asked just now, but I can offer a preliminary answer. The question of who could apply for compassionate gratuity. Initially, I felt, again, like everything else, the answer was simple. It's simple on the surface, but again, it's based on the evidence that I have. And if one were to flip the script and look at, okay, what about those who don't know? What about those who were not in the urban areas? Because again, the focus of my archival files, as I mentioned in the paper, I'm not sure whether people paid attention when I said that they all came from the office of the Commissioner of the Colonies in Lagos. So there is already a Lagos bias. Although I did mention that the people involved represented Nigeria's ethnic diversity, right, because of labor migration during under colonial rule. So I guess more than 600 people, more than 1,000 people died. I mean, reasonably speaking, more than 1,000 people died in the active service during the colonial period. But then in the archives, at least at the University of Ibadan, based on the files that were available, only roughly about 1,000 files were in the record, of which I was able to get about 600. I mean, if you're familiar with archival politics, you'd know that particularly in the Global South, documents are not always preserved in the best conditions. So 600 is a good deal, right, out of 1,000. But then, what about those who were living in Lagos at the time whose family members died and didn't apply? Perhaps some of them had relatives who didn't need, by the virtue of their class or by the virtue of the wealth of their extended families, maybe they did not require a compassionate gratuity. One point is common. It could be a legalese, it could be common sense, it could be true, but one point is common to all the files. And it is the fact that they needed the money because the dead worker was the breadwinner. And they cannot survive without the money. I'm just putting that in layman's terms, literally. So if you look at that, then you might probably assume that maybe there's a class dimension to the people who were asking for compassionate gratuities. And in addition to that, remember that I said there is also a police investigation layer. And in most of the files, I haven't come across a case in which the police said this person is lying. They are richer than they said. So at the end of the day, one might offer a preliminary conclusion, a preliminary response to say those who applied for compassionate gratuities were people who were in Lagos anyway, the colonial capital. There's an element of enlightenment in that area. And those whose family who were too poor to afford to live life on their own without the income that was produced by the breadwinner. So that's one way to answer that question, or who could apply for compassionate gratuity. Now, with respect to your question about what's next and about who was able to hire lawyers, were they able to like come together to hire lawyers? I chuckled when you said, could people come together to hire lawyers? I mean, these are people who died at different times. You don't plan to die in active service, right? So every file is a different date of birth and a different date of birth. In other words, each file is more like a personnel file of each worker. But in this case, the aspect of the file that specifically dealt with the payment of compassionate gratuity. So obviously it's not possible unless you're dealing with like a wartime situation where people died together. It's not possible for people to come together to hire the same lawyer to help them pursue their case. But then those who could hire a lawyer, as I mentioned in the course of the talk, it's also an evidence of the kind of wealth or the kind of influence or the kind of knowledge that their family members have. Because I mean, law fees, I'm not sure how much lawyers claimed, but there was already a form of public complaints type bureau. I forgot the official name, but they're like more like what we have today in developed worlds. I can't remember what they're called. Like lawyers that are like working for the uh most times working for the government or working privately, but they are helping people to pursue claims and they don't often charge unless something is awarded. So you also have those kind of situations. So at the end of the day, what you find is, for instance, another key thing that I'm just thinking about now is in the example that I cited, it's Jacob Ajimeze and Veronica Ajimeze. Their first names already suggest that they're probably Catholic. I mean, I'm guessing they're Catholic because they're from the eastern part of the country, and Catholicism, at least by the 1920s and 30s, was the brand of Christianity that was most pervasive. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, they were Christians and they were enlightened. At least they've gone through baptismal class, they've gone through maybe elementary school. So there is an aspect of enlightenment that comes with being able to get to a lawyer in this context. And even in that situation where the person was able to hire a lawyer, they still deported her internally. So even hiring a lawyer doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome will be favorable, but at least it demonstrates that there is some form of power, social power. And the name is important because when you flip the chart and you check the names of people who were often denied, and that would lead me to Patrick's question, if we were often denied, you'd often find that in many cases when multiple wives are applying, my name is, they're often Yoruba Muslim names, which has a lot of connotations, particularly for the early 20th century. Because, I mean, it means that they're most likely illiterate. And these are older women who will tell you their petty, they're already telling you their occupations. They're already telling you their occupation. They're most likely illiterate. It's a historical fact because when you find how people send their kids to school. When I say illiterate, I'm talking about in the Western education tradition, not in the Arabic education tradition. Please don't misunderstand that. I'm speaking strictly in the Western sense, Western education tradition. Because people who send their kids to school, there was some resistance and some reluctance, particularly in the early 20th century, outside of urban spaces in particular. I remember that these were women who were often brought from the hinterlands to the capital by their husbands who were working for the colonial government. So they were unlettered, to use this, they were unlettered, and also their names were often local names. So when you see those kind of factors, they are pointers to, okay, this on the class wrong. And of course, when you check the occupation as well, some would say I'm a petty trader, literally. Some would say I just gave back to a child, I'm not working, right? So that you often find that there's also a power imbalance in the talking about the agency of those who could apply for compassionate gratitude. To answer, forgot his name, to answer your question, sorry, I forgot your name. Yeah, but talking about the agency, so there's, again, you can tell from the social, like from the enlightenment side of things, it seems, what we're guessing based on names, we're reading in between the line based on names, based on occupation, based on where they're from, based on what their husband did, and based on whether they could afford a lawyer or not. So using all of these variables to determine, okay, in some cases, you've often found some people had the class, even when they were not wealthy enough, they could still go on to hire a lawyer. And in some other cases, you often find that people who are unlettered, petty traders, just seeking opportunities for survival, looking, thumb printing their letters, and not even sure whether they could read what the letter writer is writing for them, things like that, often being denied or being offered the last salary of their husband. And then tied to the question that Patrick asked is an important question that obviously is visible it's glaring in the files. It's not something you don't need to read in between the lines or massage the documenters, which was what I was like, how do you massage an archival file? But anyways, but I get what you're trying to say, like reading in between the line, reading with the grain against the grain, all the usual stuff that historians do. But it's, you don't even have to do that to see. It's crystal clear. The question of who should they even pay the money to? It's often there, and usually it's the most senior wife. Whether it's in the tradition, they're often married under customary law. Under it's not. they're not usually married in the church. Maybe in Jacob and Veronica's case, they were probably married in the church, but their marriage wasn't questioned in this particular instance. So oftentimes they often determine, is this person truly a wife to XYZ? Particularly in the case of multiple wives, co-wives. It gets worse where in cases in which the marriage rights has not been fully completed. So in that particular instance, it's not recognized. If the marriage rights has not been completed, the colonial government just chooses not to recognize the marriage. But yes, the who gets paid is also an important question. They also decide, sometimes they decide to split. If the second wife has a minor kid, they sometimes often determine to split. They split the gratuity using their own methodology. Again, there is no central methodology. It's what actually makes this work a vexatious project, right? You have to read each file. You can't actually. At first, I thought I can use social science because we had 600 files. I thought I could use social science softwares to like pick keywords from the files, like in vivo and all of these other research tools that social scientists use. I thought I could use that to like find keywords, but you can't do it because there is no methodology. The register, the language is not the same. The timeline is about 30 or 40 years plus, like scattered more or less. So it's difficult. You have to just read. And in fact, the Excel, we created like a Google spreadsheet, like a spreadsheet to just track, take biographical details and take details about, okay, was this case resolved? Why? With short phrases and all of that, which is something that Amit did for me last year. These are some of the stuffs that make the work really, really complicated. And you often find that, okay, like I said, just again to repeat that again, the first wife might be paid, or the second wife, if the second wife has a minor child, they pay the second wife. Sometimes they don't even pay any of them. It's just, and sometimes they keep writing follow-up letters. That's the part that gets interesting. So you might think the case was resolved because the file ended, but sometimes you still find follow-up letters, two follow-up letters before the file is closed. So meaning that if you see two follow-up letters and there's no further response, it means the government just decided to ignore. You can safely conclude. And that conclusion can also be made when you consider the fact that the initial letter that is written to the government sometimes gets overlooked. And then the petitioners would have to write a follow-up letter in a letter of Tuesday something instance, this kind of phrases they use. We requested for X, Y, Z. Could you please look into it? And then that's when the colonial government takes an action. So it's sort of complex. The question of resistance and agency, it's something that I would have to still think about. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I've already talked about in terms. Okay, so I think class also comes into place here. I think because class also determines who is able to pursue the. I'm viewing resistance here as the ability to pursue the claim for compassionate gratitude, just as a foundation. I'm just defining it as that. If you have a different concept in your mind, please let me know, and I'll think more about that. But I'm thinking of resistance as a pushback against the colonial government's policy. In some cases, as I mentioned, you find follow-up letters from the petitioners completely ignored. In some other case, you find petitioners who are able to hire lawyers getting responses, positive responses, absolutely positive responses, or in the extreme example that I cited, getting a positive response but with a ridiculous condition to leave the town, And then also, in terms of the transference, or the fact that the government often transfer the punishment of the living, of the dead to the living. I'm not still sure how to explain that part. If you have advice for me, I would appreciate it. But because I just thought, well, if these people are unwilling to pay, it makes sense as a useful excuse. I see it more as an excuse. I've not been thinking more about it. I wasn't thinking too much about it from the theoretical agency of the living, agency of the dead. Like, how do you transfer that? I wasn't thinking about it from that context. I was just seeing it as a plain stupid excuse from the colonial government, just as a way of ignoring claims for compassionate gratitude. I feel if they are unwilling to pay anyway, if they have a reason to give, then they would use it. That's the way I was viewing it. But if you have insights for me on how to like pursue that idea of the agency of the dead being pushed to or the punishment of the dead being pushed to the living, and how that affects the agency of the dead person and then the agency of the living person. I would appreciate it. Is there any other question? Oh yeah, I think there's a question that Adeyomi asked.
Yeah, about colonial legacies.
Of compassion. I think it's different. So at least today, I think it's mostly about bureaucratic delays in Nigeria, particularly. I think it's mostly about bureaucratic delays to payment of compassionate gratuities. Whereas in the past, in the colonial period, particularly before the 1960s, there was no real methodology. So you don't know how, so every case is adjudicated on a case by case basis. But now we know that there's a clear methodology. You know how much you're entitled to based on how many years of your years of service. Now it's clear. But now what the problem today is about the bureaucracy and the corruption in the system. That often delays the payment of gratuities and pensions for years on end. But it's not a question of methodology. Everyone knows what they're entitled to, even when officials are trying to lie and trying to falsify so that they can get their own kickback. I think there were some questions online, Michelle.
Mohammed, if you want to curate one question.
Yes, we have Ibukunle has a question. He has been waiting patiently. There's also a question in the chat, but Yvonne Simpson left. But I'm going to read it to you, Damilola. Maybe you can think about it. And the question is whether you anticipate your research can be added as a tool to project of reparation. Ibu, you can ask your own question.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Ibukun Babarinde. I'm calling from Preston, and it's just about 20 minutes to 10 here from the UK. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I enjoyed every part of it. And as someone that works in this field, your presentation is actually expanding, the boundaries of employment relations or industrial relations as we know it. In the first instance, most of the work we do focuses on economistic relationship between the employees and the employer, and we are yet to be looking at all that side of the view that you have taken even about life. So this is so much important. So now we know that employment relations doesn't just stop, okay, with the life of the workers. Personally, I've been doing some work around expanding the frame of employment relations with a view of studying the input of the society. And from your presentation this evening, we've seen that given by the numbers of people that directly are affected. So if you're talking about say 1,000 debt employees and the multiplying factor of that. So we do believe that what happens at work doesn't stop at work. Okay, and there are ripple effects of the practices of employment management into the society. And I suppose my question is, do we then see this letter as a kind of action, okay, from a set of party that would not naturally be recognized as one of the parties in employment relations, vis-a-vis the employer, the state, and the unions? So that's the first question: whether you see it that way as a constituent or as a constituency in terms of where we should expect further actions into employment relations. And let me just add this again, that I so much like the aspect of afterlife, or the aspect of employment relations not stopping even in the life or with the life of the people. Thank you very much. That was a very wonderful presentation this evening. Thank you.
I think I'll just quickly respond to that. Thank you very much, sir, for attending this talk this afternoon here. I'm actually this is someone that, in case for those who don't know him, is actually apart from his research in employment relations, is actually a fairly famous Nigerian writer and poet. So which is a big deal for me this afternoon. So thank you for your questions. And he's also a fellow, like a much more senior alumnus of the University of Ibadan. Which, again, pardon me for my bias. Yeah, so I think what my letters or the petitions that I'm exploring what they're doing or what they've done so far is to reinforce my argument, or let me put it that differently. The letters are enabling me to bring dependence into the colonial labor narratives as a key constituency. Now, is this the first time that this will be done? No. In Fred Cooper's work, for instance, and in other works by labor historians, and in gender analysis of labor history, we often find that masculinity and breadwinner, the narratives around breadwinners, how the colonial governments created breadwinners by posting colonial workers from their hometown to the colonial capitals across the countries, and how the colonial workers, particularly the men, advocated for breadwinner allowance and also advocated for an increase to their cost of living allowance, particularly in the 1940s, which led to major strikes in Nigeria during the 1940s. Wale Oyemakinde has written copiously about this subject. But what I'm doing here is to show that beyond the narratives around wives, there is an entire community. So that's essentially what I'm reinforcing. And beyond the narrative around wives moving with their husbands, or even as we've learned in the case of East Africa, how women were seen as how women in their quest to be part of the urban economy were often seen as prostitutes, even though they were not essentially prostitutes in that sense. The whole idea about women in the major cities and Nairobi, etc. Beyond narratives around women as wives or as de facto wives in this context or as prostitutes, beyond narratives around women as dependents on the key breadwinner, we actually see an entire constituency here, often consisting of way more people than we've previously assumed. So that's I think is one aspect of this research, one aspect of the existing literature that my work is reinforcing and consolidating. And thank you once again for that question. It is true that employment relations, industrial relations, labor relations doesn't end when the worker dies. And here we have the opportunity to expand on, to explore archival records to prove it. Mohammed?
Yes, Damilola, thank you for this presentation. It's really insightful. I think you've articulated your contribution very well, and it's always a pleasure to listen to your work, to listen presentation about your work. The question that I have is, and this is not to say that you already do not have a contribution to make or a paper to continue to work on or to publish. But the question is about the narrative. So I am interested in what you are doing with the narrative in terms of how we understand gratuity within labor relations. So I see in your presentation, you put compassion in quote. So given all of what you are uncovering in terms of the difficulty, the way the colonial administration made it very hard for people to be able to get access to gratuity and to deny them, I'm wondering whether there is a counter narrative that you're trying to expose here, which is that, in fact, it is not compassionate. It's not something that was done out of pity for the plight of people. It was something that was done in a way to reduce their ability to be able to access gratuity. You know, sometimes when you talk about gratuity compensation, there's the tendency to see it as something that is coming out of kindness, out of compassion toward people that are in need. But I think what you are exposing is that it is actually not that. You know, the colonial administration did all what they could to deny people this kindness. So are you countering this narrative? What are you doing with your narrative? In addition to taking it beyond the living, beyond retirement, are you questioning the way we tend to understand gratuity and compensation within industrial relations? Thank you.
I think I already referred to an aspect of your question in my introduction. So I am not essentially countering the foundational knowledge of compassion, how gratuities are used and how pensions are paid. As I mentioned earlier, the focus of this research, based on the file, are on junior workers in non-pensionable positions. For workers who were in pensionable positions and who were in positions with clear gratuity guidelines, once they passed on, their pensions were transferred to their dependents, their gratuities were paid. Here we're looking at how the government used the instruments of compassionate gratuity. The key word here being compassionate. That's, in other words, not encoded in law, but something that you do once to sort of regulate or quantify, monetize the lives of colonial workers who died in active service. So basically, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how the government used that as a tool, used compassionate gratuity as a tool of necropolitics. It could as well have been any other thing if I'm looking at the politics of how the government demonstrated their powers over the life and death of the colonial worker. It could have been another tool, but here we're focusing on compassionate gratuity as a tool for the exploration of that power of the colonial government to quantify or monetize the worth of a colonial worker. So in other words, I'm not basically critiquing the institution of compassionate gratuity pyramid. In fact, at the beginning, my introduction, I said there are studies by Gabriel Olusonya. For instance, I mentioned that in the introduction, how Gabriel Olusonya has often shown that colonial rules and requirements often existed in the books in the colonial service, but they were not often followed. Even for those that are in the for those that have clear requirements, that have met their requirements for pension payments. But I'm not looking at that in this paper. I'm basically looking at those who are in non-pensionable positions. Another thing that I didn't talk about in this paper, because I didn't want to complicate it, is the idea of provident funds coming up repeatedly, because I'm supposed to explain what that means and all of that. The employment relations of people would know. But in this case, provident funds sometimes are contributions, voluntary contributions, more like insurance that that employees make to a particular, to their, I wouldn't call it retirement account, but more like an insurance sort of. And you often find that sometimes some of these messengers often also contributed to provident fund. And in that scenario, if it's only 1 shilling that they've contributed to the provident fund, that's the only thing that their family members get. They don't get anything else from the government. So here, compassion is the real word, and that's why I put it in inverted commas. Like basically, compassionate gratuity. How the tool of compassionate gratuity became a tool for quantifying or for determining the value of a colonial worker, for determining which worker matter or did not matter even in death. I think that's. Oh yeah, the question of reparation. I don't know. I'll be honest. I wasn't thinking along the line of reparations when I started thinking. Yeah, I don't think it should. I mean, but why not? I mean, frankly speaking, I don't know, because again, here it will be complex. It would be complex. And in fact, there was a question that was raised about doing interviews. I think you asked about surviving family members. That would be almost impossible to do because, again, these are typically unlettered people. And if you Google their names, assuming that they are, you hardly find anything. So it's difficult. And since the project is self-constrained and it's self-contained, meaning in the files, really. I'm not trying to look beyond the files. I'm looking within the files. So I don't have to go through that impossible task of trying to trace relatives. Of course, I expect that there'll be one or two outlier files that would have clear references to like last names that can be traced. But those would be more like exceptional narratives. The broader story doesn't require tracing uh, uh, surviving relatives, and so it makes it difficult to fit the paper into the narratives of reparations. The question of I was thinking about the transatlantic is this history of transatlantic slavery as well when I was thinking about this, but then I realized they might be tangentially related, but they're essentially different. Unless we want to say that, unless we want to make the case that the history of colonial labor is essentially the same as the history of transatlantic labor relations, which would be too much of a stretch. So I think it's best if we analyze the history of transatlantic slave trade on a parallel and then focus on this as another parallel narrative that might have like 10% overlap at some point, but essentially different stories.
Thank you so much. Such insightful work, really looking at the precarity of basically junior workers even after that. So it's always a great sign when so many people are engaging and want to ask questions. So thank you for that. I just want to finish off today by letting you know about some of the events that we have going that are coming up. We have our Tubman Talk with Kelston Court happening on March 20th, so 2 weeks from now. And his talk is entitled Black Middle Class Family and Family Life, examining the ways in which the currency of the community cultural wealth framework function in retaining and protecting the sociocultural and economic capitals of Black middle class families. And also, we have a lot of exciting things happening at Tubman, of which is our conference in Jamaica happening in October 14th and 17th. The call for paper is out. It's our international conference. The theme is reflection on repair, responsibility, resistance, and reform, new pathways. And you could find the call for paper on our website. We're really excited to have this conference and have you all participate. So thank you so much for your attention, and I bid you good evening.